Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, Edgar Allan Poe's detective stories, and this is a follow-up talk to my pair of long talks on Poe's first detective story. Please see those. This is a shorter talk on the following sequel story, The Murder of Marie Roget, and how it does and somewhat doesn't follow the patterns that are clearly there in Poe's story, but then also I'm suggesting are also somewhat hidden, but somewhat there. And then I will follow with a short talk on what is the simplest, shortest, and sweetest, perhaps, of his three, the concluding third sequel and cap of the trilogy, the cornerstone, as it were. The Purloined Letter, which is a work talked about by philosophers and psychoanalysts and will be a slightly longer talk than this. This is a short talk on the mixed middle story and why it was based on true crime as fiction but somewhat failed, in Poe's own eyes. So, Poe's sequel to the Rue Morgue, The Murder of Marie Roget, is based on the unsolved murder of Mary, perhaps pronounced Marie, but wrongly. So, in English, Mary Rogers, a young woman who worked at a cigar store in New York City who may or may not have known Poe and sold him cigars. A particular gentleman, the news noted after her death, had paid Mary much attention at the store 3 years earlier and then left town, causing Mary to wander off and consider suicide. This is what the paper said. One paper noted that, just like a cigar, the romance had gone up in smoke. Though these are Poe's competitors at rhetoric saying this. An opinion piece argued girls shouldn't work at cigar or candy stores where they interact with men. Another paper insisted that a naval officer, a sailor, had seduced Mary and kept her in Hoboken for 2 weeks, until abandoning her rather than marrying her as promised. Another paper said that the stories about Mary running off with anyone were phony, and a reporter fond of Mary had been severely beaten by other admirers after visiting her store. So, on June 25th, 1841, Mary told Daniel Payne, a boarder at Mary's house who happened to be shaving at the time, that she was going to her aunt's house to take her aunt's children to Sunday church. He happened to be shaving at the time, by the way. Strange coinkydink. Daniel agreed to meet her later, but after a thunderstorm, Mary didn't show, and he returned home, as she had stayed with her aunt before in similar weather. But after Mary was not yet back, after Daniel returned home from his job at the cork factory, he took a coach to her aunt's and was horrified to hear that Mary never got there. Daniel had been courting Mary, as many were apparently, including Alfred Crommelin, who 4 days later, while searching for Mary, saw a crowd down by the river. A body of a young woman was dragged out of the water, and Alfred recognized the clothing, called the cops, who called the coroner, who pronounced her dead by violent means, strangled after sexual abuse. The coroner reported she had been bound with sailors' knots, not ladies' knots, gagged and assaulted by several assailants. My apologies, and there is much in this story which parallels the first and the third in saying without saying and barely leaving anything out there, but signifying a lot and meaning a lot emotionally and by motive what is barely there, or in the case of the first story, there's a bloody mattress left in the middle of the room. There is much talk of assault. There are simpler and more complex words. Let's say that, and Poe very much plays on that as the paper being very salacious, all the newspapers telling you these things. So the papers gave the case full coverage for 6 weeks, but the case was never solved. Mary used the event to lecture on not Mary, she didn't show up. Many used the event to lecture on morality, and others to sensationalize theories that went nowhere. While the theory that a gang had attacked Mary continued to hold sway, some questioned whether or not the doctor could tell if Mary had been attacked or had an abortion. And that was kindly said, but we say it, well, that's even itself a kind word, I suppose. Instead, that may or may not have gone wrong. The doctor continued to insist that Mary had been a woman of virtue. A $500 reward for information leading to solving the case was offered by citizens and the police, but even when it was raised several times over, it didn't bring results. Then, strangely, some of Mary's clothes and a monogrammed handkerchief were found by Mrs. Frederica Loss in a thicket near her roadhouse by the river where Mary was found. Loss said Mary arrived with a dark male stranger about 4 in the afternoon on the day she disappeared, drank some lemonade. This is all still the true story, by the way. This is not Marie Roget, but the story Poe's going to adapt is quite entirely like it. But I'm talking through, if it is confusing, the story first, the actual events. What's up, buddy? My cat rattles the screen door in anticipation of the twists and turns of this. Loss, German immigrant, it sounds, who had sent one of her sons to deliver a bull down the road back in the day. It's a bull market. Heard screaming just after dark at 9, which her other son down in the cellar heard as well. The son down in the cellar heard as well, and this is reported. She said she feared her son had been gored by a bull and rushed down the road after him. She heard something like a struggle nearby and then silence. There had been gangs roughhousing in the afternoon along the bank that day, and her boys found clothes in the thicket a month afterwards while playing, which is when she realized that the young woman had been Mary. The papers continued to debate whether Mary's lover or a gang had strangled her or mistreated her. It's mistreated her, abused, yada yada. There are simpler words again, or one. Poe's story, which closely follows the exact events of the case and sets them in Paris with Marie Roget, which would have fooled no one at all in New York who read any of the papers. Everybody would have known it was a slight veneer, a bit of a mask on what was pretty much the same face. Much of Poe's story takes place in newspaper accounts that the narrator and Dupin read. Again, I'm going to call him Dupin, not Dupin, Dupin. I'm just going to pronounce it like an American, Dupin, because he's duping us all the time. And Poe never went and got to France, never saw Paris, and describes it much like Boston. Dupin read just as Poe would have followed the case of Mary in the papers himself. Dupin, the genius detective of the previous story, please see my all too long talks. I will break into chapters on that. Dupin concludes that the scene of the crime makes no sense if a gang committed the crime, but does if a single sailor, Mary's dark stranger, had brought her to the thicket and then strangled her before or after passion, or Mary pleading for marriage. One of the most amazing things in this altogether, Poe's detective definitely says, and given how much true crime and, well, violence, sex, and both, and yeesh, that people still watch and are entertained as the simplest of motives and meanings that draw people into things, as Poe himself knows, trying to gain wide audience and give them something entertaining and intelligent. Altogether, simple and stupid and brilliant, again, is the theme of these stories. You have a very ingenious thing where Dupin says, as Sherlock Holmes, but before Sherlock Holmes not, because he can't help but feel the emotions of people as opposed to be oblivious to them as Holmes seems to be much, as he is carefully calculating and analyzing. Dupin says analysis is including emotion. He doesn't say that directly, but he says that indirectly in many ways. And you can also indirectly, but quite directly, as indirect as it is, conclude right between the lines, which is much the theme of the hidden, the revealed, the emotional, the manifest, and the physical, that you can see he is saying awareness of emotion in others is what gives you brilliance. He also says being able to put myself in other people's minds is what makes me genius. And he says, now if I was a gang and if I was carrying a screaming woman, which is something most people don't want to consider, but if you were a genius detective or psychic or something, you would put yourself in the situation and say, now if I was a victim struggling, which you wouldn't want to do, and conversely, which you certainly wouldn't want to do, as soon as many wouldn't, you put yourself in the place of the victim. Now, what if I were the perpetrator? We got perpetrators here. And several of them, he says, would not bother to take down rungs of the fence. He says clearly it was someone alone. They got Mary there. She wanted to be there. And then they had to move her body afterwards. So after the passion, more passion, and then not so much as much, at least on one side of it. And then he had to drag the body alone, and we have special knot lady knots, which would be sailor knots. We have something of a sailor who possibly has committed a crime. All of this suggests this very much. That you already have here that he's placed himself in the head not only of the victim, which is painful, but then also of the gang, which is not, who didn't commit the crime, as a gang assaulting a woman. a bit of, again, an unfortunate Clockwork Orange. And in doing so, which is the only value to such fiction, one could argue simply, perhaps not the only value, but, it could simply be argued, part of the value to any fiction that's revolting like that is putting yourself in the head of the villain or the assailant is revolting but necessary to do brilliant thinking and to find the girl or prevent another or something. And that's what he says, and you can draw the conclusion here, which should be paused on. He's actually saying if you want to be a brilliant detective, working for the cops or not, you should put yourself in the head of your enemy as you play the game. And also, this is Columbo now, sir, and he is very Musashi, constantly using time to bewilder and incite and anger and tick off and kick off the opponent. But you put yourself in the enemy's head and you don't have any holds barred about it, because if you're really serious about this, then why wouldn't you? Well, because it's hard. Well, then the going get tough, So, and then others get going. So with all of that, that's why he hides out, in a house in Paris and doesn't interact with others in the daytime. We think until the third story, and suddenly he's quite capable all day long, it seems, which is a nice reversal and hidden surprise. Or it's just blatant inconsistency, which is fine too. So Poe in Dupin says that the scene of the crime makes no sense if a gang committed the crime, but it does if a single sailor, Mary's dark stranger, had brought her to the thicket, then strangled her before or after passion or Mary pleading for marriage, which he highly suggests and says, as with all of this, she was mistreated, perhaps she wanted something, like that, is that he says in many ways we get in many ways. I do love Mean Streets. That's a great movie, and I've enjoyed that after this, of saying without saying things and all sorts of things. What's this? He holds up a $20 bill. What's this? This. What's this? It's like, wow. It's like, well, you owe my cousin, and what's this? And excuse me, ladies, we gotta go talk about this. This. And of course you can say this, to a friend. Or to the sawing outside. This talk won't take long, and neither, hopefully, will the saw. So, or perhaps one will take longer, we'll have to race. My apologies again. So Dupin says, the sailor dumped Mary's body after leaving everything behind in the thicket, and in Poe's story, the sailor turns himself in and confesses. Poe wrote to an editor that his story had disproved the gang theory. Just some gang did it, which may have parallels to people guessing things today, and, in Poe's words, indicated the assassin. Like the saw, as I insist. Unfortunately, Loss confessed on her deathbed. Now, this shook up Poe's story. Poe came up with the story, and he hooked it all up. And then, unfortunately, it seems, as best as we know, and I am relying on book or three of others that were, written over the past few decades, that's by scholars working on Poe and the backstories here. Loss confessed on her deathbed. The actual woman running the inn where the lover nearby where the lovers may have had a room or not so much outdoors. Loss confessed on her deathbed several months after Poe first published parts of his story that Mary had been the victim of a botched abortion. Said nicely. Nicer than that, which is again probably putting things nice. In simpler words, it's a, multi-syllabled word for specific techniques, which was criminal at the time, which is likely, and now what's going on? Well, she's running a place where people can go and have something done if they need to. So what we think the whole way through and what Poe thought was, they're going there to hook up, as it were, as Poe certainly didn't in his philosophy of furniture, as I was arguing in that piece earlier. But here, actually, the reason the son in the cellar heard the scream, which makes much more sense than everything together and Poe didn't get initially, but makes it all snap into place, she was having the procedure done and she passed from it. It wasn't even that the sailor strangled her outside after she pleaded for marriage after, if you're going to, do it to me, baby, one more time. How about a third, Well, how about a trimester? So with all of that, and the, who wants to live in an institution, said Groucho Marx, and not that guy perhaps, but perhaps he didn't, and then they went to get the services, and it wasn't that he strangled her by the river in a van down by the river, with all of this. Again, I make terrible jokes about terrible things, which is part of saying things without saying things in horrifying ways, with all the emotion. So, with all of this, that's why her son heard the screams in the cellar, is because she was having a botched procedure, I nicely say, which is just as many syllables as abortion, which is also a nice way of describing certain brute things, I suppose, especially given older procedures, and yeesh. And so actually, yeah, it's an unfortunately timely thing, not only with the indication of gangs having done the crime, let's pin it on a gang, I don't know, in a park somewhere, but then you also have here, well, actually, it turned out, and there is very nice talk about how it looks like this woman was assaulted. No, she was pure. No, she was assaulted, all right. And then it turns out this, and I'll just nicely say I didn't say anything but yes. You know? Yeah. So, the nicest and the most horrible of things and all of that. And yeesh. So, you get all of that. And Poe is remarkable here. And in the 1840s, telling us a lot. The papers are telling us salaciously a lot. A lot of horrifying detail without telling us everything. They're focused on this true crime for everybody. This is as mass media starts to get going with sensational Jacksonian politics. Mass media, the short story, the murder mystery with the twist is Poe coming along with. So, you already have people basically talking about, well, thankfully, I can tell you after teaching years of ethics, violence, sex, and violence is kind of sexual violence. It's kind of the worst you can see. Don't watch the movie Solo. It's, again, some of the worst is, again, art films. Art. It's, again, Colbert says, a 3-letter word for disappointing your parents. So Poe, who certainly disappointed his, perhaps several sets, at least a pair. Poe changed several details in the story to basically suggest, in the final version, so he had to change it around, and that's what makes this a bit mangled. You already have, it parallels what I suggest in the first story because there is a hidden crime, but the thing is, it kind of mangles it and he changes it, and it's hard. The hidden crime, and then that it turns out to be about this, it's too tricky for me to try to line it up entirely. It does line up, but honestly, it is dazzling to try to get exactly what Poe intended, how he would have hidden a crime, and then how he turned it around in order to line it up with what I think is very much the hanging, hidden murder of the second sailor in the first story. But it does line up enough, and I'm not going to labor the point and just say, yeah, I'll just labor my points on the first and the third story, and I do want to tell this one, and it is amazing in what it's saying about modern media, isn't it? Which is modern since the 1840s and onward. So, which is the time Poe's doing all his great writing and died. So, he suggests that Madame de Luc was an accomplice. So, but that would make her a hidden accomplice, which would kind of complement my theory. If it turns out in the way that he tells the story, he does not pin anything on her, but he leaves it hanging open, that her children, if you read that second story, I will argue, and it puts it in line with what I'm thinking about the first and the third stories, the hidden sailor, and then Dupin himself as the Queen's lover. You should solve what isn't solved, is the final words of the first story in Dupin himself, and his words strangely suggest the children put the clothing out in order to suggest things. And it gets all mixed up with, well, did the sailor hang on to her belongings? It sounds like what he's saying is that the loss, the woman, the actual woman beyond her fictional name, that she hung on to she had Mary's belongings, and then she put them out with her children, and that in order to make it look like she was assaulted by a gang, but that you can clearly see if clothing had been left out, and this is what Dupin concludes in the story and labors the point, because Poe clearly wants us to know that he thinks he's figured out beyond the cops that, no, that's fake evidence, because why wouldn't the clothes have been mildewed and destroyed after a month? No, it was just all of her clothes got thrown out by somebody who was hanging on to her clothes, and he's suggesting that sort of that Loss and the sailor were somewhat in cahoots. His story suggests the sailor killed Mary after, perhaps, again, highly suggesting they were passionate. She then said, marry me. He's like, no, she got furious, and then he killed her, and then dragged her body, tied her up with sailor knots so that he could carry her and haul her, took down the fence post on in a way that a gang would not need to, lifting a screaming, or not so much anymore, woman over and back the fence, and then he dumped her in the river as a sailor would perhaps, in a body such that it would sink for a while. So with all of that, but he's highly suggesting that Loss was a hidden accomplice, and that is what I'm going to suggest is the hidden crime in that there's a hidden element that Poe wants us to solve and feel out. It's kind of a secret hidden bonus answer in each of the stories. Definitely. I'm sure there's many things, but it seems to me quite consistent that he wants Loss to be unmentioned by Dupin at the end, but that Dupin is like, it's sort of can you? Without being totally obvious about it. But again, I think that is consistent. So Dupin points out in this that children would play in the thicket and find the clothes much sooner than a month later, and that clothes do not take a month to mildew when left outside, which suggests Diluc in the story holds onto the clothes whether or not she was concealing an abortion, a place to have it, or a place for a lover's tryst. Either way, it would have worked, and it seems like it went from the latter to the former, as Poe figured out, and everyone did more. He himself apparently took trips to try to figure out more and detect himself. And then somewhat doesn't report all that to us through his detective. But somewhat does. And then Diluc, the innkeeper, left the clothes out, with the help of her children, he suggests, and brought them to the cops that she left them out, and then her children are like, hey, look at what we found. At least the children were innocent, but found the clothes with her, because she planted them for her children, knowing where her children play. He says, looks like a throne right here. It's a throne which somewhat parallels the third, actually. A sort of throne of rocks. Children would love playing here. You mean they never got here in a month? Give me a break. So she left the clothes out for a bit. Her kids found them because they play there all the time, and they would have through the month, so why now? And brought them to the cops. It looks like Diluc would be the one to keep the clothes nearby in a suitcase because the lovers were staying there, which is originally what Poe wanted because they were just hooking up, perhaps, and Diluc was making a buck and not caring about young lovers. And then he realized, oh, wait, no, it's a bit more than that. Just a bit. Or a bit less. So Poe had already committed himself to the idea that the sailor had strangled Marie. But either way, Diluc, Loss in real life, had to have a hand in the crime or concealment. So it actually does carry over. In 1841, 42 years after Poe's death, John Anderson, the owner of the cigar shop where the original Mary Rogers worked before her tragic death, left a will that was contested in court, and it was alleged that Poe was paid $5,000 to write the story to divert suspicion from Anderson himself, which is considered quite impossible. The character in the story is LeBlanc, the white, like Le Bon of the first story, the good. He's just a simple, stupid hero here. But the claim is very far-fetched. Again, it seems like that's just sensationalism about Poe, and hey, why not? Poe almost came to blows at a party in 1844, when someone suggested that Anderson, Poe's friend, was using the death to help his business. So Poe was, in fact, quite passionate about the case in more ways than one. Perhaps it was suggested that Poe was profiting himself from it as well. And here, in fact, I might, rethinking this, I am going to suggest in the third story that I do think, and spoiler alert, I do think that it is Dupin himself who is the Queen's lover, and no one seems to suggest that, but it makes sense, again, if we follow it out and try to find things that are left unsolved. And in fact, it is possible, again, Dupin would have loved to have been Mary's lover or not, regardless of his fictional character, Marie. But I don't know that. I don't know Poe personally, not now. So, who knows? And who truly knows Poe. But that is my shorter talk on the second of the three stories. And I am possibly going to wait for the sun to die down a tiny bit. And then I am going to launch here into the short but sweet third talk and explain the hidden lover, which again I think is Dupin himself, of the purloined letter, which is leaving things out in plain sight, like Dupin himself is the central character of the story. Just a bit Achilles. And has a weak spot or two. So, with all of that, much love, much happiness, a weak spot in the eyes, in fact. And I will see ya again, if in fact I do ever see ya.